Georgia's Secretary of State and State House Speaker called for investigations into voting delays in Atlanta and across Georgia on the day of the state's primary. Voters faced long lines and issues with equipment. Some polling locations didn't open on time and others struggled with new voting machines. Much of the problems were concentrated in Atlanta and surrounding counties, where voters described arriving before polls opened and standing in line for hours. For more on the issues taking place and the investigation, we're joined now by political analyst Brian Sobel. And Brian, we should say that the AP is now reporting that Joe Biden has won the Democratic presidential primary in Georgia. But certainly the discussion about how this all went down and how we move forward is continuing with, there's so many issues associated with voting day in Georgia.
Absolutely. And Claudine, there has been a history of problems in Georgia, across the state, in Atlanta, in nearby Cobb County, throughout the state, where voters can't get into the polls, or when they do, things are broken. I talked with a journalist just a little while ago based in Cobb County who reported that at arriving at the polls, she found a situation where some of the machines didn't work. They had to use a stylus, so the stylus wasn't working. And the overarching problem here is, for a lot of voters in Georgia, they are prone to voter suppression of Black Americans if they are not able to get to the polls and weigh in. And of course, we've been hearing about that for quite some time.
Yeah, when you're analyzing the problems, though, when it talks about, there's so many sources for what these problems are, right? Is it the technology? Is it the poll workers? Is it poll workers who don't want to come out because of fears of coronavirus? And how do you fix some of these problems before we get to November, when certainly the discussion about how these elections are going to go forward and whether or not these results will be challenged and things like that in these areas that already have problems going into it, how do those get fixed? And do we have any kind of sense that enough can be done to change this?
Well, I'm worried because there isn't a lot of time, and Georgia's ground zero for the types of problems that are occurring around the nation, whether it is machines that don't work, inadequate training of poll workers who don't show up because they are fearful around coronavirus or anything. And all of that combined, Claudine, makes it a tough thing that has to be solved very, very quickly. Georgia is going to be an important state, and there are a couple of Senate races there. There's all kinds of reasons why Georgians have to get this right. And what's ironic is this has been going on for so long that you would think one by one these problems would have been tackled. But we're seeing these kinds of problems really across the nation.
It's across the nation, and specifically in Georgia, we can say by the numbers that there are segments of the voting population disproportionately affected. You mentioned African-American voters, Black voters in that area who, if there's access problems that are demographically hitting certain populations more than others, they're going to be hit hardest when they try to vote.
Well, one of the comments I would make is it's a systemic problem that disenfranchises Black voters potentially, and there's numbers to suggest that it actually does hold down the voting in that population. But the problems are even more than that in Georgia. They have to do with white voters in higher end neighborhoods not being able to get things to work, not being able to vote, having absentee ballots lost. It's systemic. Unfortunately, the problem with it affects one part of the Georgian population more than others.
Yeah, it is a deep problem with many facets that certainly we hope can be addressed, especially as we head towards November. Brian Sobel, thanks as always for your insight. We appreciate it.
Absolutely. Take care.